powerful and extraordinary Pharaoh, loved the moon god, Yah, or Yahweh, and when he was booted out, he took with him that fidelity and faithfulness to Yah, or Yahweh, who was the quintessence of Egyptian spiritual wisdom. Because Moses was obviously a great intellectual, a great thinker, a great sage, learned in all the ways of the Egyptians, it says in the biblical text. And he brought with him this secret knowledge, which he then handed down. So that's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, research it yourself, read my book. I mean, I'm just putting this forward as a hypothesis. It makes sense to me that that's the origin of the Yahweh tradition that Moses brings into the Hebrew people, that he manages to get out of Egypt. But I don't think, yes, I'd love to organise a mediation between Ahmose and Moses, in the afterlife, because they really ought to make friends. The whole craziness of what's going on in the Middle East is because of this rupture, this split. But actually, we're all worshipping the same deity. This is the paradox. So later, this Yah deity at the time of Ahmose was then called Khonsu, the moon, and then became known as Thoth. It's interesting because if my theory is correct, why is Jewish thought so much in love with mathematics? Why do they love number? Why do they love writing and texts? Well, they're worshipping Thoth as well, only they call him Yahweh. So wouldn't it be ironic for history, if you were looking at this, from the perspective of the gods, that these different tribes and people are all fighting over different names and terminology, but actually they're all worshipping the same God. So, I put it to my learned friends that there may be some validity in this. And watch the documentary by James Cameron called Exodus. It is a mind-blowing exploration of very latest archaeological research that has discovered things that prove that what I'm saying is probably true. Okay, it's important, and then the irony is that same deity, Hermes, was then rediscovered in the Renaissance in Florence, the Hermetic Renaissance, which brought us Freemasonry, the kind of esoteric wisdom of Dee and all those amazing Freemasons, Francis Bacon, and on up to Napoleon and the Grand Orient. And what if they're all also worshipping Thoth? Maybe that could be a clue to reconciling these traditions. And then also in Islam you have the same thing, because Thoth is worshipped also secretly, inwardly in Islamic thought as Idris. Idris is recognised as a prophet of divine wisdom, and he's associated with Hermes. And there's a whole tradition in Islamic thought of the Hermetic mysteries, which a colleague of mine has written a whole book about, the Hermetic traditions of Islam. So I think, to me, this leads to a possible intellectual reconciliation of these traditions. And as I was saying earlier, I want to mediate this conflict going on in Gaza. This is how I would do it. The groundwork has been done. There's no need for all this violence. What we should be doing is using all that energy, instead of making bombs to kill each other's women and children, is to research all this, to invest in archaeology, invest in scholarship, invest in the humanities, and find the truth about all these things. They've never found the grave of Moses. He's on some Mount Nebo, interestingly, the Babylonian deity of wisdom, in Jordan. Let's get some archaeologists and find his grave and his lost autobiography. Yes, it's true, I worshipped Yah, I'm sorry, whatever. Anyway, I put it forward as a hypothesis. Now, the next deity we're going to look at, and this is the card that was done by my Syrian friend, beautifully done, of Thoth, in all his technicolor glory. The next god I want to look at is Sin, who is a parallel, very interesting deity, the six of fire in the Tarot of the Gods. And there's a very interesting story behind him. I'm just going to put the light on because it's getting dark here. And I don't want to... the fire might need a bit of wood on. Right. So, the six of fire, Sin, called Suen or Sen or Shin, in Aramaic Sin, was called Nannar in Sumerian, and was the god of the moon in the ancient religions of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylonia, and Aram. So we've got a moon deity in Egypt, Thoth, Khonsu, and we've got the equivalent in the Mesopotamian region. So Nannar was a very important deity. These are male deities, the Tarot of the Gods. Most cultures think of the moon as female, but actually in the Mesopotamian tradition, Sin was a male deity. And he was important in Ur and Uruk and in different parts of the Mesopotamian region, including up in the northern part of Mesopotamia at Haran. And what's so interesting is that the biblical tradition tells us that Abraham was living in Haran, which is in the very northern bit of Mesopotamia, in what is now south eastern Turkey, because the rivers Tigris and Euphrates sort of come from the mountains of Turkey and then flow down. So in Haran, it was sacred to the moon god, Sin. And we know that Abraham was a devotee of Sin in the beginning. So this is the paradox about the Abrahamic religions, is Abraham was a pagan who worshipped Sin, the moon deity. But his tradition, his lineage, is like a link with the esoteric Kabbalah, because I think the oral tradition that Abraham represents knew the inner wisdom of this, not just the outer wisdom. And I think what Abraham wanted was a pure worship of Sin. He wasn't saying there is no God. He was saying, no, let's worship God truthfully and truly. And let's be prepared to go on a journey. So in the card you've got someone sitting, Sin, and then someone on a journey who's Abraham, being prepared to abandon his home and everything for his faith. Later, fast forward, when the Muslims turned up, and according to this chapter, Islam also carries traces of the worship of Sin, the moon god, because in Arabia, the moon was really, really sacred. It's such a hot part of the world that they prefer the moon to the sun even, because you can move about in the moonlight at night in the desert regions. And so this is why the moon is on the top of all the mosques, and why they use the moon calendar in Islam and in Judaism. So my speculation here is that the moon god, Sin, was very influential behind the traditions, not just of Haran and the Abrahamic faiths, but more broadly in the Semitic regions generally. The Sinai Desert is named after Sin, it's thought. So behind this kind of, it's not that you're worshipping the moon, you're worshipping the light in its gentle phase. You're also worshipping time because the moon shows the phases of time. You're worshipping the transforming power of form, which changes, but ultimately that which stays the same behind it all. So, whatever day it is God's day, is how the Sin tradition sees things. What shows, I think, that something to this is that in Haran, when the Muslim army turned up, they were pagans in this ancient city of Haran. And they said, what religion do you follow? And they said, well, is this a trick question? And they said, well, do you have a book? Because in our religion of Islam, you're allowed to be a person if you have a book that you follow, a sacred book. So have you got a sacred text? And the people of Haran on the doorway said, look, go away and come back tomorrow, we'll give you an answer. They were thinking carefully. And when they came back, the Muslim army, they were told, we follow the Book of Hermes, the Hermetic texts of Thoth. Because, I'm speculating here, but I think I'm right in saying the people of Haran knew that this was also their god Sin. But they couldn't tell that to the Muslim army because they'd be clobbered as pagans. And fortunately they had a Hermetic text to hand. So they were able to say we're Hermetics, effectively. Which is, a very strategically useful move. And they were therefore able to survive because in Islam they're called Sabians. And they were honoured and recognised as such. Now in my commentary on the Quran, where I've explained all this, I believe I've come to the conclusion that Muhammad himself visited Haran. And he visited which is now called Sanlerfa, which is very nearby, which is where Abraham was born. The biblical scholars of 19th century Britain all thought he was born in of the Chaldees, being down at the, towards Kuwait in the southern Mesopotamian region. But no, if you actually read the text properly in the context of the time, he was born in northern Mesopotamia, near Haran, in what is now called Sanlerfa. And that was said by all the great sages and rabbis. Maimonides, the greatest rabbi of Judaism, said Abraham was born in Sanlerfa. I'm not going to argue against Maimonides here. So all these biblical scholars looking for Abraham down in the south of Mesopotamia have been looking at the wrong place all these centuries. And I've tried to explain all this. So this situates Abraham in moon country. And it explains why in Judaism the moon is so important. Now, fast forward, that tradition gets down into Egypt. Moses is totally in love with the moon god, Thoth, or Yah. He discovers that he's actually from the moon worshipping people of the Hebrews, and that they worship secretly, don't tell anyone, Sin. And he realizes God, it's the same God. There's just one God, isn't there? And he gets his insight and inspiration of this double confirmation. Anyway, I'm I'm trying to sort of peer over the events of history. This is what transpersonal history does, and see how these prophetic lineages come from common sources. Okay, fast forward. What does that mean to us now? You know, we're living through a planetary crisis where this stuff is still not resolved. What can these gods teach us now? I would say if we sat down, if I was sitting with a mediation of Muslims, Jews and Christians in Gaza now, if we can get a ceasefire and it stops, happy to teach this. If we were to properly attend to the wisdom of Thoth, listen to it deeply, through deep listening, like we've learned from the Zulus is the key to peace. And if we were truly to listen to the wisdom of Sin, all of us truly, join in prayer together and go into that inner stillness, I believe the path will be opened up towards healing and reconciliation at a deep, deep, deep level. To me, it's like when I've sat on Greek islands watching the moon over the Mediterranean at night, warm night. It's when that path of moonlight opens up and you can peer into infinity. And the beauty of it is just amazing. Well, that's what I think is on offer to mankind from these deities that have come to us tonight, from both Thoth and Sin. That's the path to peace, that path of beauty. Why wouldn't we want to take that instead of this other path, which leads to just constant, heretical denigration of beauty, destruction, and total madness, which is the mass killing of fanatical hatred? No, it's time to press stop to all that, and get with what I would regard as the true path of divine intelligence. So I think that's what these tarot things mean to us now. They're showing us a path to peace through beauty. And is this teaching orthodox? I would say absolutely. This is true orthodox, as in the sense of going straight to truth, which is the definition of orthodox in Greek. Straight to truth, like the beauty of the moonlit path. That's the path to go on, my friends. So I think that's any comments or questions about my interpretation here. Have you come across these deities before? They didn't teach you this in your French lycée. I wasn't head of religious studies or philosophy. If I was, I would have brought it all in. Because to me, this is fascinating. I know Napoleon knew some of this stuff, which is why he went to Egypt. Yeah. And because of that, we got the hieroglyphs translated. Because of Champollion, who was another Freemason. We owe it to them. Big thanks. Right, I think I'll finish with a poem. Is that okay this evening? Because it's poetry time. And yes. This is only a little poem. It's poem number 724 from my Oeuvre. I've written over 1,000 poems. Thomas Hardy wrote about the same number. So I'm up there with the Hardys. But this is, what I try to do in my poetry is put all the philosophy into simple images and simple, lines. So this is called Punctuations. It's the punctuation, as before, that matters. Where to put the comma, which half-moon choirs and notes to put where, and at what point in the line. These marks pace out our wondering, our pauses, before we say them. Hard words. What goes before them? Or after? Is it an assertion or a question mark? A dot or a ... That is the question to ask. That is the race to pace and the rhythm to rhyme, which is posed. And the scope of what's next and the hands that are outstretched and holding, and the fisherman's line, and the tainted hook, and the dumb beast's bone, and the waves wandering. Voila. Un petit poème. I must translate my work into French.